Marina, what led you to decide to write a book?
When I've told people my family story, they've been amazed that they know somebody in New Zealand whose father was born in a concentration camp, and immediately jumped to the conclusion that I must be Jewish because people associate concentration camps with Jews. And when I explained that I'm not, and that there were concentration camps in Indonesia, very few people in New Zealand and Australia knew the story of what happened in Indonesia. And over 1 million people died in Indonesia in concentration camps in the Second World War. And over the years I've known about my story, I've been learning about it, and I thought one day I should put it in a book and educate people, not just as family history for my own family, which is part of the reason, but also to let other people know what the story was of the South Pacific in the Second World War.
So is your book a family history, or is there more to it than that?
It is a family history, but I've woven some fiction in amongst it. After travelling to Java myself, I realised that there was some beautiful parts of Java. There's a story about Borobudur in the story, which also has a family story behind it, and that my auntie learned about Borobudur when she was a child at primary school. And she said to me, when you go to Java, you must go to Borobudur. So there are some important family stories, and also there's some information around Indonesia, and there's a second story that weaves through the story as well.
So how did you decide which factual details to keep in and which bits to sort of make up or fictionalise?
Well, my family story was the historical fiction, so there was no messing around with that. Right. But I did read a series of books called The Seven Sisters by an author by the name of Lucinda Riley, who's sadly no longer with us. And I loved flicking backwards and forwards between now and then. I loved journeying from present day to past, and I thought that could work.
Is that how the story is told?
Yeah.
Is that how you've kind of resolved that issue?
Yeah, so there's two stories. There's the modern day story about Honor, who's looking for the story of her grandparents and travels to Java to find historical information. And then there's the backstory, which is the story of my family in the concentration camp.
So who's the character of Honor based on? Is that a real person?
Well, it's based on me. But I didn't
you're real.
I didn't want myself in the story, and I was really wrestling with that. I felt very uncomfortable about writing about myself. I just thought, I wanted to share what I'd learned, I wanted to share what I'd seen, but I didn't want me to be that person. And then one day I had an aha moment that actually it could be a character who could be a different person to me, and that would give me some liberty, that she could see other things and she could experience other things that I actually hadn't seen. So creating this character Honor actually opened up the potential.
So how important was it for you to get accuracy in the detail around pre-war, pre-Second World War Indonesia, and how did you do that?
Well, it was really hard, given that my father knows very little himself. And that was because when his family left Java, there was essentially a shutdown of information. My grandfather said, that's the end of Indonesia. We won't talk about it ever again. So the only thing that I have had to work with is my auntie's recollections. She was 8 when she went into the camp, and she has recalled good information so from sort of 4 till 8. And then there's just me reading books about Indonesia, me reading a diary of somebody else who was in the same camp, and then going to Holland and visiting the Indonesian Dutch Museum at The Hague this year gave me a little bit more insight. So I have done a lot of work to ensure that I understand as much as I can.
And have you visited any of the locations in Indonesia itself?
All of them. All of the locations in the book. I was writing the book, trying to be as authentic as I possibly could, and realised I didn't know what it smelt like. I didn't know what it looked like. I didn't know what the heat felt like. I didn't know the places. They were just names. I was looking at a map, trying to imagine it all. And one day in the middle of trying to write, I went, that's it. I have to go. I'm stopping writing. I have to go. I have to see it. I have to feel it. And I'm not writing anything more until I've been there.
So what was it like for you emotionally then in that case to visit some of the places that your grandparents had actually lived in and your father as well?
The day that I arrived in Jakarta, and I mean, you don't see anything Dutch. You have to go and look for it. And Jakarta, you know, it was interesting. I was enjoying myself. When I arrived at the Dutch central part called Kota Tua in Jakarta, I walked in there and suddenly my hairs stood up on my arms and I felt my DNA jangling, and it was like, oh, wow. I went to a Dutch cemetery where you could barely see the names of people on the tombstones. There were lots of moments that were deep breaths, and I realised, you know, and one thing that was really lovely was that the Indonesian people haven't gone through and destroyed everything that belonged to the Dutch. They've appreciated the history that they have, and they've looked after the buildings, and everything is immaculately cared for. So visiting Indonesia, Java, is a lot like visiting Europe. And that was something I wasn't expecting. Beautiful, beautiful, historic European buildings.
Wow. So that was visiting Jakarta in Java, but what was it like to travel to, because you also went to the internment camp, the concentration camp. That must have been, I can't even begin to imagine what that must have been like as an experience.
I was so grateful that I got the opportunity to visit there, and that was through a Belgium company that created a private driver that picked me up in Semarang and took me to the camp. I thought that I was going to a paddock. I thought it would be green grass and fences. I didn't realise that I was going to a concentration camp that was still in use today. And when I walked through the gates, it was in the same dilapidated case that you can imagine a concentration camp would be. There'd been no lick of paint or anything, and people were staying in it. It was accommodation for the military, the Indonesian military, and it was the most unbelievable experience to be wandering around dormitories and buildings and knowing that today, when I was there, there were, I don't know, maybe 50 or 100 people there, but when my father was there, there were 7,000.
Wow. I'm interested to know, since your book is chronicling your family's history, and obviously being in an internment camp is well, I can't begin to imagine what that would be like. Do you think that the trauma that people experience in that sort of situation, because, and I want to draw this back to your grandfather's comment about drawing a line under Indonesia and saying, well, that's it, it's finished, we're not going to talk about it ever again. Is it that simple, or does the trauma and everything that goes with that carry on, and does it get passed down through the families? I mean, do you have any sort of lived experience yourself of what your grandparents went through? Yes. Sorry for the long question, but...
So in the case of the Second World War, very few people received any kind of therapy or counselling. I think probably a faith in God was the number one thing that got people through their trauma. But children never received counselling for losing their mothers or fathers, or for being in a concentration camp. And individuals could have put their hand up at any point in their life and say, I'm traumatised by what I've been through, but most didn't. I met some therapists in Sydney about 30 years ago who specialised in Second World War concentration camp And I said, I'm so surprised you exist. Like, how do you get your clients? And they said, their children bring them to us kicking and screaming. So it's the children who knew that their parents needed help. It definitely comes down into the next generation, but it's often not conscious on the part of the parent. And how it shows up is depression, bitterness, anger, anxiety. And I've definitely experienced those as the child of somebody who's been through a concentration camp experience.
Now, the events that you describe in the book took place, well, it's over 80 years ago now, and in another country. So what do you consider as the relevance of your book and its stories for readers today?
Probably nobody else is going to have exactly the same story as I have. However, what I know is that this story is my story and it's shaped my life. And everybody has a story that has shaped their life, but not everybody knows what it is. And I think that when we search for our family story and when we understand it and when we visit the places of relevance to our family, it actually gives you a fuller picture of where you came from, who you are, how you came to be, and what your family represents, who you are, and maybe your purpose.
So on that point then, has writing The Golden Lotus changed you personally?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I said to you before that I came to the point in the book where I absolutely had to visit Java. And my experience there over 2 weeks, I was there for 2 weeks, going to the place where my father was born, visiting my grandmother's grave at the war cemetery in Semarang was I can't even put it into words how incredibly special that was. But what that started, when I got home from that journey, I went, now I'm busting to go to Holland because I've seen Java and now I'm 50% Dutch. I have to go to Holland. And some family met me in Holland and I said that I wanted to visit where my grandmother was raised. And so they took me to an apartment block beside a canal right in the centre of Amsterdam and they said, this is the house. And I just burst into tears because not only did I not know about this or them, but my grandmother died when my father was a baby. So we had no matriarch in our family. And when the mother figure leaves a family, it leaves a very deep scar. And I felt that walking through her life and meeting her nieces and nephews and finding out about her family life before she came to Indonesia, it was really, really emotional and really important to me. And like standing in Amsterdam, and I was there in Amsterdam for the 80th end of the Second World War commemoration. So it was 80 years in May this year. I was in Amsterdam for that. It was a really amazing moment to be in Amsterdam.
Was that the most surprising part of this writing journey, or are there other things that you can point to and think, that's changed my life?
When you write a story, you experience it chapter by chapter, line by line, word by word. And I remember writing the chapter where my father's born. That had me in tears. I wrote the chapter when my grandmother died. That had me in tears. And so I guess when you're telling somebody else's story, it's not perhaps as deeply emotional, but each word, each sentence, each paragraph, each chapter has cost a lot of emotional energy, and it's been therapy for myself. It's been really significant.
So what is next for you in The Golden Lotus? Will there be, well, is this the first and last book, or will there be more? Have you got the writing bug sufficiently?
I've got the writing bug. I've absolutely got the writing bug. And when I was in Holland, I was thinking about the next story. So I definitely have the strong feeling that The Golden Lotus is only number one.
That's fantastic. Marina, thank you very much.